Uh, my story is going to be something of a combination between my father's stories from the Depression and kind of my own personal story. I think my parents both lived through the Depression, and they never really talked about it, to us kids anyway, in my childhood, but I think the way we came out was influenced by their experiences during the Depression. Part of the legacy of the New Deal programs, I would say, was that they enabled people to be able to continue dreaming, to continue having the ability to dream. So what if a chicken coop could become a real home? What if you could dream people into existence? So throughout my childhood, the cottage down the hill from the house housed my parents' studios. My father, Archie Musick, was born in 1902 to farmers in Missouri, and he first came to the Colorado Springs area via hopping freights in 1924, and came back in 1927 to study art at the Broadmoor Art Academy and remained sort of a perpetual art student until World War II, basically, except for 1929 to 1931, he was studying at Art Students Leagues, the one in New York with Thomas Hart Benton, and the one in Los Angeles with Stanton MacDonald Wright. My mother, Irene Kolodziej Musick, was born to working-class Polish immigrant parents in Cleveland, Ohio, just 100 years ago this month, March 1913. And they supported her love of the arts, first in Cleveland Art Museum classes, and eventually she went to graduate school at Cranbrook Academy and studied with Carl Millis and Maya Grotel. I remember the sweet blend of fragrances in my father's painting studio, the beeswax and turpentine and Damar varnish, and maybe some cooling cooked rabbit skin gesso. The beautiful, brilliant, intense colors of pure powdered pigments in glass jars sitting on my father's painting cabinet. Up the steps from his studio was my mother's ceramic studio. It was filled with the deep, dark, cool, moist earth smell of clay slaking in stoneware crocks, and the squeak, squeak of the pedal that was powered by foot that was attached to the flywheel on the potter's wheels that my father had made for her, one of which had the seat of an old tractor. And the sounds of birdsong and dappled light filtering in from outside. I'd spend many, many happy hours there with my mother. I'd make little clay figurines or throw pots on the wheels or watch her measure out the dry ingredients of chemicals for the ceramic glazes that she formulated herself, measuring them out on the apothecary scale with the little brass weights, and later she ground them by hand using a mortar and pestle. So there was always a sense that we could entertain ourselves and we could make things that we wanted. There were always art materials, always plenty of books. There were the hills and rocks to play in. And in the winter, family trips to the mountains to go ice skating on frozen beaver ponds and frozen reservoirs. And in the summers, some of my father's friends from the Broadmoor Art Academy would come out from where they now lived in New York, Ethel Magafan and her family, and Ed Chavez, and we'd all go camping together. And everybody had a sketchbook, and the kids and adults would spend the day sketching, and then we'd all show our sketches in the evening around the campfires. So before that childhood time when my parents' studios were in the cottage, the Clausens lived there. And you've heard about that time from Doug, so I'm not going to go into that, but it was great. Before that, the cottage was my father's home and studio. And it started out actually in 1932 as an 8-foot by 16-foot chicken shack that he had moved there with the permission of the then landowner, Charlie Bonnell's father. And over the ensuing years, he took it apart and added to it and reassembled it many, many times. But that first winter, 32 to 33, was particularly bitterly cold, 6 weeks of 0-degree weather. And he was dirt poor. It was 1933, the depths of the Depression. He wrote later that there was an angel in town in the form of a butcher who would sometimes trade soup bones for paintings. So he would boil up these soup bones with a few vegetables in a big pot of mulligan stew, and then set it outside where it would freeze solid. And then when mealtime came around, he could just chip out his meal with an ice pick and heat it up on the wood stove. Throughout these years, though, he kept diaries, and these were, a couple of lines per day. And in addition to frequent entries of painted all day or colder than blue hell, there were many, many entries about dinners and parties and who was at the party and which party they went to after that party. And many movies, many of the movies that Bill just mentioned, Marx Brothers, Duck Soup, Greta Garbo, but also occasionally attending a lecture or even the symphony. So you get the sense from these diary entries that these artists were poor, but they were seizing life, they were supporting each other and seizing every opportunity that came along. One of the opportunities that came along got off the ground in December 1933, and that was Roosevelt's first public art program, the PWAP. The funds had to be allocated and the art produced by March 1934, and kind of a short window there. Boardman Robinson was the head of the Broadmoor Art Academy, and he selected Archie to paint one of the murals in the City Auditorium, as you heard from Doug. So that was a very short-lived program, but two other federally funded arts programs followed that. One was the Federal Art Project, which provided money for paintings, paid artists to do artwork, but the artists had to demonstrate dire need, which wasn't too difficult. The other one was the Section of Fine Arts, and that one was by competition. And that one was to provide public art in federal buildings, mainly post offices. Archie applied for 3 of those, and he got the Red Cloud, Nebraska Post Office commission. So he painted that on canvas in the Chicken Shack studio, and then rolled up the canvases on a 6-foot drum, which he had fastened, attached to the back of his Star car, and chugged up to Nebraska through blizzards and thunderstorms. And fortunately, the paintings weren't damaged, and managed to install them in the post office, despite the scaffolding collapsing and other tribulations. And even managed to fend off some of the critique of the locals who complained that the cattle in his mural were too skinny. He said, they've just been driven up from Texas, that's why they're skinny. The other New Deal funded mural he did was the one that's in the Manitou Springs post office. That one he painted directly on the wall, and in the process of developing that one, he developed the genesis of what became his lifelong personal egg tempera painting technique that he used in all his paintings. The diary from that period, though, is full of references to the war and wondering if he's going to get drafted and which of his buddies had gotten sent off to the war effort. But he said later, when interviewed by the Archives for American Art, that it was a wonderful period. There was encouragement to develop techniques, and there was a sense of wanting to put his very best into his work. And he also said that the New Deal art programs made it possible for the artist to have a more solid standing in the social scheme, converting the artist from a precious parlor monkey to a useful tradesman so that he may walk on the sidewalk with respectable people. Well, before 1932, fall of 1932, when he built the Chicken Shack studio, that summer he had worked for a concession at Carlsbad Caverns. And his job was to solicit names of tourists when they were having lunch down in the lunchroom, 750 feet underground. And then he would take these names and run hell-bent up the mile-long underground trail to the surface of the earth, set up the names in 6-point type, print the names in the tourist newspaper on a letterpress printer, and then the papers were available for the tourists to buy when they came out of the cavern a couple of hours later. Other than a couple of other minor tasks, he had a lot of time to explore on his own. And he had always had an interest in exploration and a curiosity. There were a number of caves and tunnels that were not open to the public, and he was able to put his lock-picking skills, well, that's another story, but he did make good use of them. And one of the excursions, clandestine exploration by 4 guys, I think, was to the New Mexico room. And the New Mexico room is still not open to the public, but they discovered there an underground lake. And Archie couldn't help himself. He leapt into the lake, swam in and out among the stalactites, and the experience always stuck with him. And so did the tiny, sharp aragonite crystals that pierced his feet when he waded out of the lake. Well, came the end of the summer, and he had a financial dilemma. He'd been paid $6 a week all summer, and he had to his name just that, $6. He had to drive a very unreliable car from southern New Mexico to Colorado Springs. The sheriff had an eye out for him because he had never shelled out the $9 to buy New Mexico license plates. What to do? Well, he'd been wrestling with a terrible, terrible temptation. He happened to know that sitting under 4 feet of water in a pool called the Wishing Well, at the far end of the big room of Carlsbad Caverns, 750 feet underground, was a pile of money. And he wrestled with his conscience for a very long time. And finally, his conscience relented on the condition that if he borrowed the money, that he put it toward a worthy cause. Well, the worthy cause he had in mind was an idea for a children's fantasy book that was going to be sort of dream adventures in the tradition of Alice in Wonderland, that would be filled with edifying morals and therefore beneficial to society. So, however, his conscience would not let him go ahead with the deed until he had written part of this story. Well, it turned out that the heroine of this story was an imaginary daughter of his named Pat. So the part of the story that he wrote was he's standing on the shores of this underground lake, bidding a sloppy farewell to his beloved, who has appeared in a boat somewhere out on the lake. And they are both, he wrote later, wallowing in martyrdom. She refused to stand in the way of his artistic career, and he refused to drag her down to it. So they're parting forever, and their conversation turns to this child of theirs, Pat, who it turns out is, so far, only a figment of their erstwhile plans. Well, in the meantime, in this story, the character Pat is standing there invisible, unable to cry out, listening to all this, watching all this, and thinking, what, but do I not even exist then? And he'd gotten this far and later wrote, the thing was so confused at this point that I didn't know if she was my dream child or I was her dream pappy. So saying to hell with them both, I left Pat and her dopey dad to stew in their own juice. And later, maybe I'd come back and see how they were doing. But it was enough to assuage his conscience. So as to the wishing well, that's another story. Suffice it to say, he got back to Colorado. And so skipping back to that period in the life of the studio cottage, that was my idyllic childhood, there was actually a shadow over it, which was that when I was 14, my mother was diagnosed with cancer. And that was pretty much a death sentence in those days. And there was no hospice, and you didn't really talk about your problems. You didn't want to burden anybody else, and so we kind of stumbled through the next couple of years, pretending everything was okay. And a month after I turned 17, my mother died, and I headed to college in Oregon that fall. And then after that to graduate school in England and Ireland. I'd always been really especially close to my mother and not all that close to my dad. He was sort of this benevolent presence. But so he died when I was 25 and I was still in England. But he left this unpublished manuscript memoir. And it was full of his stories of adventures and hikes during the Depression, and working in national parks and his art school days. And yearning for adventure myself, I found it very inspiring. And so anytime in the ensuing years when I was in situations like being stuck in a 6th century carved cave in a cliff in Bamiyan, this is 2 decades before they blew up the giant Buddhas, or solo skinny dipping in exotic places, or solo backpacks. There was, at least to some extent, the spirit of that manuscript was partly to blame. But also, in the process of kind of following that manuscript, I was getting to know sides of this character that I hadn't really known in life. Paradoxically, I too was commissioned to create exactly 3 publicly funded murals, these through Colorado's Art in Public Places program. I also started following the footsteps in the manuscript memoir a little bit more directly. So Yellowstone, and Arches, and just 5 years ago, Carlsbad Caverns. Well, the New Mexico room is still not open to the general public. But I found myself standing by this pool at the far end of the big room, 750 feet underground, that was probably the wishing well. There's no such sign, no such designation now, which is a good thing. They're not encouraging people to throw stuff into delicate cave pools. But I couldn't help reflecting. Had Archie created an imaginary daughter, or was I, through this manuscript memoir, creating an imaginary father who had created this imaginary daughter who was standing by this pool trying to figure out if she was a figment of his Well, no wonder Archie left Pat and her dopey dad to stew in their own juices. It's been 3/4 of a century and we still don't know who's dreaming whom. Thank you.